Recording in progress.
Thank you very much. And then this. And then pointer options. Okay. Today we will look at chapters 7 and 8. This is often described by many OT scholars as the Messianic Kingdom Sermon. Okay. It's a very different style of writing from the previous chapters, the night visions or the night or the dream visions that he had. This is bombarded by statements about his authority. So whatever he's saying, he's speaking with that authority that is derived from God. Good evening, Judy. Welcome. And so that's what we will be looking at. Now, when we talk messianic here, we're not necessarily dealing with messianic prophecies that are seen as being fulfilled in the New Testament, but that dream of the Jews who returned from the exile, that one day a deliverer will come to correct everything that is wrong and to give the world a new start. This section is depicted as a series of messages. And the reason it's depicted that way is because they are truncated by this little refrain, and we will see how it goes. First, he gives us the date. He's very precise. He says that this is the fourth year, the fourth day of Kislev, that's the Hebrew month, the ninth month of the Hebrew calendar. And the dates in this later period of Old Testament are very secure. So this would be the 7th of December, 518 BC. This is the time of King Darius the Great, not the Darius in Daniel, totally different Darius. That Darius in Daniel is known as the Mede. He was king only over Babylon. He was kind of under king, the way Herod the Great was under the Romans. This is one of the emperors, one of the great emperors of the Persian Empire, Darius the Great. There are several Dariuses in the Persian Empire, so we need to keep our heads clear. The sense of speaking with the authority of God is depicted in three different ways. The use of the expression, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, which appears twice. The word of the Lord came to me, okay, which appears 3 times in these 2 chapters. But the most important one is Ko Amar Yahweh Sebaoth. This is what Yahweh Sebaoth says, 10 times appearing in these chapters, particularly in chapter 8. So every little sermonette, so to speak, is driven by this expression. This is what God says. Zechariah has a very strong sense that he is not the one speaking. He's just the mouthpiece. The Hebrew word, the main Hebrew word for prophet, the word nabi, literally means a mouthpiece, kind of like the mouthpiece in a trumpet through which you blow the sound. God is the one blowing the sound into that trumpet, okay? And the trumpet just conveys the sound that God is blowing, okay? The third part of this is a question that was posed to God through the prophet. You see, since the destruction of the temple in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews who went into exile, and probably the ones who ran off to Babylon or who still remain in the land, they developed a special day of fasting. They would fast for an entire month to commemorate that destruction of the temple. Now that they're back in the land and they are rebuilding their temple, they wanted to know, should they continue with that fast? Now, there are very few fasting periods in Old Testament history. This is one of the more colorful ones. It lasted over a whole month. And so they asked Zechariah to inquire from God, should we weep in the 5th month? Should we fast as we have done over the years? Now, by the time he came back to the land, this is 518 BC, they went into exile in 586 BC. So you're talking about well over 70 years that they have been doing this, keeping this fast. Now, Jewish fast is not like Ramadan or Muslim fast. In Ramadan, fasting means that you invert the food order. So you don't eat between sunrise and sundown, but you can eat after sundown at night. In Jewish fasting, there's no such thing. So if a Jew fasts for 3 days, it literally means 3 days without food or even water. So this would have been a very long fast. We don't know if they ate at all during this month or whether they staggered it depending on the needs of the people. There were strict laws in the Torah about who should not fast ever. Pregnant women, children, elderly people, sick people. So a lot of people would not be fasting because the Torah doesn't allow you to fast if you have some underlying conditions. So it's very enlightened concept of fasting. The Adventist concept of fasting usually means no food for 1 day. And so you might eat breakfast on Sabbath and then you might eat dinner. Basically, it's not eating lunch in most of the fasting that's promoted by the church. This kind of fasting is unknown in biblical texts. Jesus, we are told, fasted for 40 days. Now, there was a story on the internet a few months ago of a man who attempted to fast for 40 days and then he died at the end of the fast. Humans are not made to survive that long without food. So we probably imagine that they did not literally fast every single day for a whole month, but rather the fasting was scheduled for that month. Something else about Jewish fasting or biblical fasting, apart from Yom Kippur, they were not permitted to fast on Sabbath. In Jewish thought, all the way through history, the idea of fasting and Sabbath, which is supposed to be a celebration of creation and covenant, those two things don't go together because fasting is a symbol of sin. It's a symbol of repentance. And the two symbolisms of the Sabbath and the fasting cannot be put in the same place. Now, Yom Kippur was a bit different, but the fasting actually took place even before the actual Yom Kippur. And the reason is Yom Kippur is a day of mourning. We'll be talking a lot in Sabbath School Quarterly tomorrow about the Day of Atonement. But you have to understand the Old Testament Yom Kippur to understand anything about the Day of Atonement. And the Hebrew phrase in Leviticus about Yom Kippur is not actually fasting. It says, you shall deny yourself. And so to the Jews, that means deny yourself of any kind of pleasure, any kind of activity that would bring you some pleasure, because that's when you must stay in a state of repentance until Yom Kippur passes. And so we could imagine that they fasted during this month. The month was scheduled for fasting, but they wouldn't do it on Shabbat. And certain groups of people were not required or would not be allowed to fast because of their conditions. And so God answers their question with a couple of rhetorical questions himself. He says, when you fast or when you eat, do you do that for me? This is really a cutting question because God is implying that their religious ritual, like fasting, may not be for his interest or for his sake. They're doing it for themselves. This was a problem before the exile as well. And then a second question is, when you're doing all this fasting or eating or whatever worship you're doing, did you listen to the words of the prophets? In other words, if you are not following the instructions of Scripture, and yet you try to cover it up with a good worship experience, those two things are incompatible and therefore not desirable from God's point of view. I'm going to show you some translation of verse 9, which is a bit demanding, but I'd like to show you first through the Hebrew. Mishpat emet shafat, which literally translated means judgment. Mishpat means judgment. Emet means truth, and they are a noun pairing. And shafat is judge from the same root word. And chesed, which means love, and rachamim, which can be translated graces or mercies or compassions, do to one another. Very similar language to Micah 6:6-8. God had told something similar to the people of Jerusalem and Judah before they went into exile through Micah, and now he's repeating a similar message through Zechariah after the exile. So the message remains the same, but we'll come back to that. Do not oppress widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor. Do not scheme against each other. Do not follow the example of your ancestors. This is a common theme in Zechariah, comparing their potential failure to the failure of their ancestors before the exile. You meet this more than once in the book. Learn from history. Learn from what happened to them so you do not repeat the mistake. Now, verse 10, the first time we meet this kind of language is actually in Isaiah chapter 1. But let's come back to the verse 9, which is very, very close to Micah 6. And let's compare the different translations. So NLT says, judge fairly and show mercy and kindness to one another. Okay. The NET Bible says, exercise true judgment and show brotherhood and compassion to each other. The Holman Bible says, make fair decisions, show faithful love and compassion to one another. And then the NRSV, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another. Basically, the play on words that you have in Hebrew, two main ideas. The idea of justice, and then the idea of love, chesed. So mishpat is used a couple of times, and words that pair with it, emet, which means truth, and then chesed, which is the Old Testament equivalent of agape in the New Testament Greek. The message was similar to Micah 6 because they challenged God in Micah. How can we ever please you? You never seem satisfied, no matter how much offerings and sacrifices we bring you. You're always finding fault with us. And God says, who asked you anything except to practice mishpat and to practice chesed? So same message is being repeated here. This is more of a reminder, unlike Micah's time, the 8th century, where people were living the opposite of mishpat and chesed, so justice and love. These people are being reminded not to fall back into that trap. Zechariah recognizes that religious people seem to repeat history easily, to make the same mistakes that they did in the 8th century. Now they're back. Exile is over. Captivity is done. They are in Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the temple. They must learn the lesson that their fathers in the 8th century did not. The failure of their fathers in the 8th century resulted in the exile. And so they must not repeat that mistake. I'm not sure which of these readings you like. They all basically are saying the same thing. Judgment that is true or fair, okay? Love expressed to one another, and so on. The next part of his message concerns Mount Zion. And God says through the prophet that he is passionate about Mount Zion. Now, in the writings of the later prophets, as we get closer and closer to the end of the Old Testament period, there's a lot of concentration on this concept of Mount Zion, which is really a spiritualized name for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. This is what God says. My love for Mount Zion is passionate and strong. This is NLT translation. I am consumed with passion for Jerusalem. So Mount Zion, Jerusalem are the same thing. I am returning to Mount Zion and I will live in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called Faithful City. The mountain of Yahweh, Sabaoth, will be called the Holy Mountain. So Jerusalem will become faithful and holy. And Mount Zion is the mountain of Yahweh. Now, why this interest in Mount Zion? By the time we reach the 8th century, before the exile, Mount Zion, or the name Zion, had become not only a parallel name to the physical Jerusalem, but an even more important name as a replacement for Jerusalem. So while Jerusalem represented physical, political realities, Zion represented those spiritual, theological realities. And so the names are often used interchangeably over and over in the prophets. Also in many of the Psalms, particularly the post-exilic Psalms, where the name takes on a spiritual significance. The only other parallel to this is what we meet in Revelation 21, where we find the idea of a mountain in relation to the New Jerusalem and in the description about the Lamb's bride. This grand celebration of Jerusalem that is similar to Zechariah. So clearly, Zechariah has an impact on Revelation. The way John describes the New Jerusalem, not simply as a city, but as this celebrated bride of Christ. You know, in Revelation, the church is not the bride of Christ. The church are the guests to his wedding. The city, this, whatever it is, this New Jerusalem, is the bride of the Lamb. It's a very interesting thing because throughout Christian history, Christians have maintained the idea that the church is the bride of Christ, not in Revelation. Because Revelation is using language from Zechariah and other prophets, but particularly Zechariah, where the passion of God is for Mount Zion, for Jerusalem, almost the passion of a husband for his wife, the deep love that you read in the Song of Songs, so on. So this is what we see, and it's repeated in relationship to the New Jerusalem. So this is not simply a reference to the coming of Jesus, because the coming of Jesus had little to do with Jerusalem itself, but to the final messianic age, which in New Testament terms means the end of the world and the recreation of the planet. The next message that you have in chapter 8 is this: God will gather his people. This message becomes a really significant motif in these later prophets. It started with prophets like Isaiah, who talked about this gathering, about how the nations will stream to Zion. But in the later prophets like Zechariah, this gathering motif becomes very significant. Interestingly, Christians, particularly evangelical Christianity, has taken a new interest in this gathering idea as a physical, actual reality. Adventism almost never talks about this except in theological works, because Adventism seems to assume that Israel has no role in the final plans of God. Therefore, these messages are completely spiritual in nature. And so we've never had Bible studies or lessons or books or treatises on the gathering. Only some small dissertations at the theological seminary. The evangelical world right now is very much wrapped up with this concept, and the main motivation for their support of the nation of Israel today is because of this concept. So what does he say? He describes this gathering in very beautiful poetic language. Once again, old men and women will walk Jerusalem streets with their canes and will sit together in the city squares. And the streets of the city will be filled with boys and girls at play. Describes a city that is peaceful, that is at rest, no war, no troubles, no terrorists, no suicide bombings, none of those things, where people from the oldest to the youngest could sit around in the open and not worry about some missile flying over or some, in Jesus' days, a zealot trying to assassinate somebody or a Roman army rushing through. But he also says, you can be sure that I will rescue my people from the east and from the west. This is Hebrew expression, means from everywhere in the world. I will bring them home again to live safely in Jerusalem. You can see why the Christian church historically and some churches today have seen this as being more than just the physical Israel that's being gathered, but rather all of Abraham's spiritual descendants as well will be brought from all over the world, and they will live not in the physical Jerusalem in Christian theology, but in the new Jerusalem where God's people will be. But you have to think of this from Zechariah's point of view. Most of the people who were called by the name of Yahweh were not in the land. They were scattered from Egypt to Persia and all the way across Turkey and all the way east up to India by this point in history. And so for those exiles returning to the land, it was a significant idea that the people will all come back to the land. This is the land promised to Abraham and his descendants forever. And so how can it be the land of promise if the people of promise are not in the land? Now, when the Zionist movement was born in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s, it was this theology in Jewish teachings that inspired, even though some of the leaders of the Zionist movement may not have been very religious in nature, but the idea of the gathering of Israel is embedded in their cultural psyche. And this is why Jews of all persuasions, wherever they are in the world, still celebrate the festivals the same way, following the Seder plate concept, which talks about the prosperity of the land and the food that they eat, how that will build up. Having been to Israel twice, I've also seen how they have actually resurrected the land. You know, I've been into the West Bank, never been into Gaza, but the Palestinian people have basically killed the land, you know. And when Israel pulled out of Gaza, Gaza was at that point, because about some 10,000 Jews lived there with their beautiful greenhouses and flowers and farms and dairy farming. They had turned Gaza into a virtual Riviera of the East. And many of us don't realize this, but a year after Hamas took over Gaza, they went around and they burned all of those greenhouses and those farms and desolated the land, literally. Okay. And when you actually see that, how these modern Israelis turned the Negev desert, which was desert even in Abraham's time. It was such an important desert to Bible stories that Negev means desert, but it also means south. So it's the southern border of the land. But today, it's flourishing. Using advanced farming technologies, they have brought life to the Negev. And this is what is being described in this gathering. that the land will again prosper, people will again be there. And so evangelical Christians see this as a literal fulfillment. Seventh-day Adventists, by and large, do not see a literal fulfillment here, but rather a spiritual fulfillment with the new Jerusalem. And you can take a pick. Personally, I think it is a combination of both, because the prophecy had to be literally real to fulfill other prophecies in the Bible that speaks about the restoration and the elevation of Jerusalem. But there's also the spiritual component that comes in, the theological component that comes in later, the New Testament. The next little message is that God's temple will be rebuilt and the land will be renewed. Notice that whenever you have talk about the city, about Mount Zion, there's always talk about the land. This is so important to the Hebrew Bible. From the first time that God promised land to Abraham, the rest of the Old Testament has one very large common thread that binds all of the Old Testament, and that is the motif of land. And this is beautiful. I am planting seeds of peace and prosperity among you. The grapevines will be heavy with fruit, the kind of fruit and grapes that they had when Joshua sent spies into the land, when Moses sent spies into the land. The earth will produce its crops, and the heavens will release the dew. The land of Israel does not have a lot of heavy rain or a lot of rain. Much of the water is subterranean in dew form and so on. This is quite interesting. Once more, I will cause the remnant in Judah and Israel to inherit these blessings. See, this is almost a repeat of the covenant made with Abraham and replicated through Joshua and so on. Among the other nations, Judah and Israel became symbols of a cursed nation. That was the exile, but no longer. Now I will rescue you and make you both a symbol and a source of blessing. God told Abraham that the nations of the world will be blessed through him, that God's blessing were to flow through this channel. And so comes the encouragement. Do not be afraid, be strong, and get on with rebuilding the temple. They had doubts, they had questions. Should we really spend our time or energy trying to rebuild the temple? We can never bring it to its former glory. And God was not interested in that. He says, go on, build, because you need that symbol. The temple represents Mount Zion represents Jerusalem, Jerusalem represents the nation, and it represents the land, God's land. And so they were given this very encouraging picture that they would see this prosperity. Now, those of us who have studied history and studied how the modern nation of Israel revived the land, it's being seen in some circles as almost a miracle. A land that had basically gone fallow and fairly useless, very little rain. In southern Palestine, they only have rain about one month in the year. And it was really important to plant your seeds and hope the grain develop around that expected rainfall. 11 months in the year, it's fairly dry. In the northern part, Galilee part, maybe there's a lot more rain and therefore a lot more water. And so the revival of the land here coincides with the rebuilding of the temple. And maybe that's why that language is used in Revelation. This temple-like holy city, the New Jerusalem coming from heaven, brings about the revival of the earth, the new heavens and the new earth. And then he goes on to talk about the new blessings that will come with this renewal of the earth. God says, I'm determined to bless Jerusalem and the people of Judah. Notice the language throughout this messianic sermon. God's passion, God's determination, God's intentionality. The traditional fasts and times of mourning you have kept in early summer, midsummer, autumn, and winter, they are now ended. God is telling them you need a paradigm shift. They will become festivals of joy and celebration for the people of Judah. Notice the language. Fasting and mourning should be replaced with joy. So love, truth, and peace. When you look at Psalm 137, a psalm probably composed during the early years of the exile, we hear this lamentation. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept. They were challenged to sing Yahweh's songs, and they say, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? But when you read Psalm 126, which is probably one of the first psalms after they returned to the land, you hear something different. When the Lord returned the exiles, when the Lord restored the fortunes of his people, we were like dreamers. Our mouths, our tongues were filled with joy and singing. No other nation in history has ever experienced this utter desperation, diaspora around the world, and then complete elation at the gathering, at the return. And this has happened more than once in Israel's history. We only think of the modern one because that's the one we are living in. But this happened more than once in their history. The only comparative material in the Bible, again, is the celebration of the Lamb's wedding and the renewal of the earth in Revelation 19 and 21. Similar kind of language, the joy, the celebration, this tremendous feasting. No more fasting, no more death, no more crying, etc., etc. And so Zechariah's prophecy has a huge impact on Revelation, not only in the symbolisms, but even some of the concepts. The idea that human life is marked by mourning, but in the new recreated world, it'll be marked by unadulterated joy. And that is the picture being painted here. And this is why I believe that you need to keep some element of the physical as well as the eschatological, because the physical becomes a microcosm, a lens through which to see that final fulfillment. Now, for the Jews, this is still a future reality. Most modern day Jews, particularly the Messianic Jews, Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, they're still looking forward to the coming of this Messiah, the full restoration of the land, the full recovering and the full gathering of the people. For Christians, they've taken that into an eschatological level where we see that in relationship to the third coming of Jesus, the elimination of sin, and the recreation of the earth. The next message is this: God will stream the nations to Zion. He borrows language and thought from Isaiah, who first introduced this concept. People from nations and cities around the world will travel to Jerusalem. The people of one city will say to the people of another, come, let us go to Jerusalem and ask the Lord to bless us. You find beautiful poetry using similar language in Isaiah chapter 60 to 62. Many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord of heaven's armies, Yahweh Sebaoth, and to ask for his blessing. In those days, and this is an intriguing word picture, in those days, 10 men from different nations and languages of the world will clutch at the sleeve of one Jew and will say, please, let us walk with you, for we have heard that God is with you. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have this word from God through Moses, that God's intention was to make the nation of Israel the head of all the nations. But they chose to be one among the nations. We want a king, they said to Samuel, like everyone else. Eventually, they ended up the tail by being exiles in Babylon. And so the prophecies here are of the restoration of that initial status, that initial mission of God. Now, Christians would like to think that none of that applies to Christians because, we are not Jews by birth. But we have to be really careful that when God sent Jesus, he did not send him to Rome or to Persia or to India. He sent him to Jerusalem. Jesus was born a Jew. It was a renewal of that mission and taking that mission on a cosmic scale. So the mission never changed. The format did. This is the thing about typology and typological interpretation. Whatever we think the idea is, it carries over. But the format does not. To give you an example, in the sanctuary, a lamb had to die for sin. And the death is by fire, being killed by fire. In the fulfillment, it was not a lamb, it was Jesus who died, but not by fire, but by crucifixion. So the idea that something or someone must die for you carries over, but the format does not. Okay, and so we need to keep that in mind as well. I think what the New Testament does is to take these prophecies and show through that physical lens of what will happen at the end of time, eschatological fulfillment. Now, these ideas appear in many places in the Bible. First time in Isaiah 60. Arise, 60 to 62. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord shines upon you. Darkness, thick darkness covers the earth. And then it describes how the nations will stream to Zion. And this is repeated in many places, this concept of the nations coming to the kingdom of God in Revelation 7, 14, 15, 18, 19. So we see this again and again and again. One major difference. In Zechariah and all these prophets, the nations come to Jerusalem to become the people of God. In Revelation, the people of God are in Jerusalem. There are nations that will gather around the New Jerusalem, but they don't gather for repentance. They gather for the final war. And so the format, again, changes a little bit. In the prophets, it was a physical city with all of its hills and Mount Zion and Mount Olives that comprise this picture. In Revelation, it was a holy city from heaven, a celestial city. Yes, it will land on a mountain, and that mountain is said to be Mount Olives. So there is still that physical connection. And so we cannot completely divorce the physical expectation of the Old Testament from the eschatological final expectations of the New Testament. And that brings us to the end of this particular section. The picture that emerges is a new world, complete paradigm shift, where fasting and mourning becomes joy and celebration, where war and troubles are replaced by perfect peace and security. So much so that the elderly and the children can walk outdoors and play outdoors without any sense of fear. And clearly, the ultimate fulfillment of this has to be what Revelation tells us, that final creation of God. Can you imagine what that world will be like? Now, if we did not have the New Testament, then we would have to wait for a physical fulfillment of the prophecies of Zechariah and all these later prophets, that Jerusalem would become that symbol of peace and security, and that literally the nations would accept that God is king and come to Jerusalem seeking God. But here's the thing. The first known hymn of Christianity, recorded in Philippians chapter 2, says this, that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that he is Lord. And that becomes a reality only after the third coming. Because those humanity that will not make it to heaven, that will be destroyed in the lake of fire, for one last minute, they rise up because they recognize either we overthrow this king and his kingdom or we are done for. And the ones in the city, there are about 25 songs in Revelation that celebrate the worthiness of God, the worthiness of Christ to overcome, to destroy, to rebuild, to renew. So the format clearly changes. It's like our computer. When computers first came, we had these almost paper-like saving devices called floppy disks. Today, we cannot even find floppy disks on the market. I think you probably could still find online, okay? And they are practically useless because no computers have an entry point for them anymore. Today, we have other kinds of things for doing the same thing that those floppy disks did, but they're totally different. And yet, they do the same thing. So the prophecies prophesy this new age, the Messianic age. And the Jews literally are waiting for the Messianic age. The New Testament comes around with a different format and prophesies a new heavens and a new earth, not just a new age. And so the Old Testament prophecies morph into the New Testament prophecies to create an even bigger reality. Whether you think of the new heaven and new earth in Isaiah, compare it with Revelation, or this new Messianic age in Zechariah 7 and 8, and compare it with the New Testament fulfillment. And that is spoken by Zechariah as something that God has revealed. The fact that he feels the need to repeat over and over and over, this is what God says. This is not my word. This is not my vision. I did not see the future. This is what God has shown. This is what God has revealed. This is what God has determined. I hope that you pick up on the two things that are kind of unique to Zechariah in this group of prophecies: the idea of the passion of God and the determination of God for his people. The prophets speak about this, but none in such eloquent terms as Zechariah, that God has this passion for Zion, this passion for his people. When I was a kid, Adventism taught God had a different passion, and that is to destroy sinners. So we were told that if you had an unconfessed sin, God would be so happy to say, go to hell. And for many years, it made me wonder if it was worth following such a vengeful God. And many people today still say that the God of the Old Testament, this happened in a conversation just about 2 weeks ago, that God of the Old Testament seems so vengeful and so warlike and so bloodthirsty that I can't really relate to him. But I've spent a lifetime studying the Old Testament, partly because of that question. And I've discovered the more I study it, the more I see the God of the Old Testament is so filled with passion and determination for his people that he will go to war against all the nations of the earth on their behalf. But more importantly, that he promises a new world, new order, new creation. Now, Zechariah may not have seen to the very distant eschatological future that John would see, but he saw enough to provide a lens, like looking through one of those special lenses that have an infinity feel in them, that it looks like they just keep going and going and going. December 1977, I was stuck at Manipur boarding school in Moirang. There were a couple of other, they both were from South India. One was from Kerala, one was from Tamil Nadu. And both relatively young men. One of them was married. And so the school closed down because of the Christmas holiday, the year-end holiday. We had nowhere to go. None of us could go anywhere. And not far, at least to the human eye, it looks like not far, there's some beautiful looking mountain range. So we decided about few days before Christmas, let's go and climb those mountains. Let's see how far we can go. And we discovered that with every peak we climbed, there was another peak beyond that, sometimes higher, and another one. We climbed several of them and never came to the top. We realized that this was a range, not just a set of mountains, but a mountain range that ran on and on from the eastern part of Manipur into, I don't know, maybe Mizoram or Assam or whatever. So after a few mountains of climbing, we finally stopped and said, we're not getting anywhere. Half the day is gone. Let's go back. So we trekked back all the way to school. And so looking at time, looking at God's plan through the eyes of the prophets is like climbing a mountain range. So we see the intentions of God for the first time in Isaiah. But when we climb Isaiah, we get Micah. When we climb Micah, we get Amos. When we climb Amos, we get Zechariah. And eventually we would get Revelation or John. And so we have to put all of those ideas together. We cannot dismiss the physical reality, but we have to look beyond it. And so Zechariah is one of those people who had a clear view of what will happen to the world when the Messiah actually shows up. Now, partly because Jesus did not fulfill these particular prophecies, that many of the Jews at the time of Christ found it difficult, especially those at the scholarly leadership levels, found it difficult to accept him. Because if he was really the Messiah, this is what would happen. The ones who did accept him saw the format change that came, leading towards a different ending than just this physical ending. But I love the word pictures here about the restoration of the land, because it tells me that the new creation of God will be even more glorious than the restoration that the nation of Israel has brought literally in the modern age, or predicted by these prophets about the Messianic age. So we have physical lenses through which we can see that distant future. All right, let me stop the recording here.